Hey everyone, this is a quick tutorial about getting started in Resolve specific to working with footage from the Sony FS7 that's been shot in a log mode. There are several other Resolve and color grading tutorials online. Links to those are on the Canvas site, and those are going to walk through a lot more detail about how to work in Resolve and what you're doing and some different techniques and such. But I did want to give you a couple quick pointers specific to working with the FS7 and just getting started in color grading that way. So take what's in here, but combine it with those other videos. In this case, you can see I've got my sequence already in here. I did whatever the appropriate workflow was to get it out of Avid or Premiere, or maybe I just cut it in Resolve. And now I'm ready to start doing my color grade. And you can see, just looking at the footage, it's been recorded in a log mode. You can see it has that washed out, desaturated look that we're used to. That's how the camera's shooting, again, to preserve this extra data for us to work with in color grading. So I've got my sequence in. I'm gonna go over to the color tab here. And here's my shot. You can see there's just 2 clips in this sequence. It's very simple. And the first thing I'd like to do is just kind of bring this back to normal. So I'm going to put a LUT on it, and a LUT that's specifically designed for the log mode I was recording in, to just bring that back to our standard, what we call Rec 709. So I'm going to right click on the node for this clip and go to my LUTs. And in this case, built into Resolve, I have some 3D LUTs, and I was shooting on a Sony camera. And you can see there's several here for the slog3 gamut.cine, which is what we were recording in, and several different ways I can go with that. And if you were shooting and exposing this normally, I'm just going to use this one, Cine to LC709. So I'll do that. And you can see it just kind of brings the footage roughly back to normal. This would be maybe what I would call a color correction more than a color grade at this point. We're just taking something that doesn't look right and kind of bringing it back to something approximating correct. And in this case, we could also look and see if this even looks quite correct. And I would say, maybe this looks like it's skewing just a little purple, so maybe we need to shift some things. I'll go into my primaries, and if I think it's skewing just a little purple, I could just pull this just a little bit away from that. If I do it extreme, you can kind of see I'm pulling it towards green, because that's kind of the opposite of purple. If I reset this, that's kind of where it was, and just looking at a little blue purple shifted to me, so I'm just going to pull it a little bit this way. Okay, so now I've got something that maybe looks approximately normal. And that doesn't mean this is good, but it means now that I've kind of corrected this back to normal and can start grading with it. I do want to reiterate, we could have recorded the footage sort of looking like this if we didn't use a log mode. The problem is we're basically throwing out a lot of data to do that. In this case, we're keeping all the data, and even as we work through multiple nodes, all that raw data is still there, and it's processing it with all that data there the whole way through, as opposed to if we had recorded this and already lost some data before we even get in here. So even if we're starting now at the same point that we would have if we didn't record this in log mode, we're starting from something that looks the same but has more data to work with. Okay, so now I'm going to get into my color grade. So this is the first thing you want to know when you're working with that FS7 footage, is the easiest way to kind of get it back to normal is just to throw a LUT on there. I'll show you can do this manually. So if I said, I really don't want to work with a LUT for some reason, I want to try to get this back to normal. Okay, I'm going to pull up my scopes, Command-Shift-W, and I'm going to try to kind of just bring this to something approximating normal manually. And that's not bad for a quick first approximation. So to compare that with, this is what I did manually. This was what the LUT did. You can see the LUT maybe a little more variance in the color compared to what I did, maybe a little more saturated. They pulled it up, but you can do this manually. I just think it's easier to use the LUT. In that case, you're kind of starting with something that's designed to work with this particular log mode and get it back to what it was. Let me delete this node. We'll turn our LUT back on. Okay, so once I've got it kind of back to normal, I'm going to do my color grade. Obviously, depending on what your film is and what kind of style you want and what you want the look to be, you will want your image to look a particular way that won't be applicable for other films. So I'm not going to try to say here's what your image should look like, but I do want to show you kind of how to approach the color grading from here. So I like to, once I've got this as sort of my base node that's bringing everything back to normal, make another node to start actually doing my color grading, where I'm actually doing some more stylization. Option S on a Mac. And the first thing I like to do is, even though I've kind of got this looking more or less normal, I want to get everything evened out where just technically my specs should be. So, looking at this here, I can see I don't have anything kind of down at black. I have a little bit of true white up here. I think that's this little bit shining through the trees here. But one of the first things I always look for in a color grade is, in most circumstances, and yes, there's going to be exceptions, but as a rule of thumb, if it's kind of normal looking shot, I want to have something that's black and something that's white and kind of use that full dynamic range of the image that I have. So in this case, I want to pull my lift down a little bit so that I really get my blacks kind of dark. And now I've got my gain probably about where I want it. So I've got something up here at true white, and I've got something down here at true black. I think that looks like it's probably this phone here based on what's showing up here on the graph. The next thing I'm going to do is play with my gamma to kind of get the overall brightness feel of what I want. So if I'm leaving more or less the brights and the darks alone, each of my lift gamma gain is going to affect the whole image, but it's going to affect more of the darks here, more of the brights here, and more of the mids here. So if I darken down my mids, I get something that tends to look a little darker and richer, like that. If I brighten this up, I get something that starts to look brighter and maybe a little more washed out. If I brighten this up too much, I might have to pull my lift down again to bring some blacks back. And now you can really see I've got this black here, full screen this, in the phone here, and pretty dark here, and everything else is pretty bright. So in this case, I would say, for a average looking image, I've probably got my gamma too high. On the other extreme, if I bring this really far down here, you can see I've still got this spot of bright white here, a couple other areas that are getting pretty bright, but mostly this image looks pretty dark. So that's going to depend on the style you're going for. I think that's a little much for me. I'm going to bring this back up a little bit. The other thing you can do is, my black here actually does look like black, but if you had something where, like, let's say your blacks are off. So let me actually just create that for a second. Okay, this does not look good, but one of the issues here, aside from the fact that my whole image looks kind of weird, is that my blacks are off. So they're off color, and you will see this, and this ends up being noticeable. A very common place you'll run into this is if somebody was trying to do, like, let's say a day for night or something, maybe shifted. This is obviously not shot for day for night, but kind of shifted the whole thing blue or something. And then down here in my blacks, you notice I don't have anything that's a true black. Everything kind of has this wash, in this case, of blue over it. So if I wanted that blue wash, but wanted to maintain this feel that it's not blue, that I haven't just shifted everything blue, what I need to do is look at my whites and look at my blacks and kind of even them out. So if you look up here, you can see, here's my whites, and you can see where they separate out, where there's not enough green and red and everything's shifted blue. And same thing down here in these things that are very dark, you can see I got my greens and reds down here at the bottom. Those are the things that theoretically should be black, but the blue is shifted up above them. That down there. Okay, in this case, what I might do is go into my log mode, and I'm going to shift these pretty extreme and say I really want my low range just to cover the very bottom part of the image here, and my high range just cover the very top part of the image. So now you see if I'm like moving this around, if you look at my waveform graph over here, you'll see it's not affecting the rest of the image. This is how log mode works. It's just affecting that very low stuff. And in this case, what I'm going to try to do is kind of bring things back to a normal so that that part that's supposed to be black, the red and the blue and the green, all line up and get it back to black. And if you look at this, if you look at the phone here, you can see this is now actually getting back to a black. I've now pulled it up a little high, so let's pull that down to a true black. So even though the rest of this image is shifted blue, this is now back to a true black. And let's do the same thing on the high end. Again, if you see, if I'm moving this around, it's just affecting that very high end. It's not affecting the rest of the image. And in this case, I need to add some more red and green. And I might need to shift this a little bit. Okay, and get those evened out and pull this up. Let's see if I can see it better. Look up here, I've gotten this back to a true white. So now I've got a white and a black, and you can still see this doesn't look great, but you can see that now I've at least got a white and a black, and it looks less like I just put a blue wash over the whole thing than that I've actually done something sort of intentional. So that's one of my first tips that I would do, is I always look for, unless there's a clear reason not to, getting something that's a true black and something that's a true white. Okay, in this case, let's reset this node, because that was where I was trying to do something weird. So I've got that done. The other thing that I usually want to mess with right from the get-go is just checking on my saturation. You know, and do I want it super saturated? Do I want it all the way to black and white? And in Resolve, 50 is kind of your normal point. That's wherever it had come in from the last node. And in this case, I think I do want to add a little bit there. Now that I've gotten this back to something approximating normal, I can start really playing with my grade. And again, the other tutorials are going to go into some depth on this, but just show you quickly a couple of the tools. Let me give myself a few nodes here. So one tool is your power windows. So you can affect parts of the image differentially. So let's say that I wanted it to look like it really was kind of bright sun coming over here. I could do something like a gradient. And the length of this arrow will be how quickly that gradient drops off. And I could just say, you know, let's just brighten up that gradient a little bit. So I'm adding some brightness to that side of the screen. And if we toggle this on and off, you can see it's brightening over here. And then this is affecting sort of how quickly it sort of drops off there. I could tweak exactly where this is, and it's when I'm moving it around, you can see it pretty easily. But if you get things done right in the way that you want them, usually it should look pretty natural, and I shouldn't be able to see it if I look at this and notice like, oh wow, there's obviously a gradient here. It just looks like it's pretty bright over there. You know, maybe I want that same brightness coming off of this area over here where it looks like there's some sunlight hitting in there. So I could add another one. Again, I usually like to soften these up a lot, makes them less obvious. And one thing I'll note is you can actually move these even off the screen and still affecting, it's just gradually sort of dying off as it gets to there. Okay, so what we've done is just sort of brightened up those corner areas. So that's one tool you have at your disposal. Let's bring this back to fit, is your power windows. I will say with those, one thing I like to do, and it's going to kind of counter some of what we just did, but at the end, so the very last node in a series, is just have a little bit of vignetting, kind of draw your eye to where you want the audience to be looking. So I'll throw a little power window on here as an oval. And you can do this really quickly if you have a control surface up. Aspect. Okay, I'm going to make this really soft, because I really just want it to be very subtle vignette there. Okay, and I'm also going to reverse it. So I'm going to click this over here, and if I look over here, I can see it reverses. So now it's kind of graying out this middle. It's saying whatever I do isn't going to affect the middle. It's just going to affect the outside of that. And then I'll go in here and I'm just going to kind of offset dark a little bit. Okay. And so you don't really notice it there. Again, image looks normal until I started toggling on and off. So that was our original image. This is with the vignette, original with the vignette. And you can see it just kind of bring your eye in a little bit very subtly. So that's another kind of common thing you might want to play with. Let's go back over here. Something else I might want to do is affect certain parts of the image. So maybe I want it to be more like a fall look instead of this sort of bright greenery. A couple ways I could do that. I could do it with some power windows and kind of arrange things. But just to show you different tools that are available, one I have is my HSL qualifier. So this is going to be, I pick a range of colors I want to affect. So in this case, I'm going to kind of click on this green and drag it through some of here and kind of say I want all this green stuff. If I turn this on, I can see what I've affected. And that actually grabbed pretty well. Maybe gonna soften that up just a little bit so I don't get anything super harsh. And you can also see the controls here. So if I said, I'm grabbing things that are too much into the blue, let me really just grab things that are more in the green. And you can see how that's shifting what's getting picked up or not. You can also combine these things. So if I said, yeah, I want these greens, but I really don't want any of this stuff down here where maybe it's not grabbing it as cleanly. Let me add a gradient to this as well. All right, so I could say, just want to affect that top stuff. And kind of subtly die off from there. So you can combine these things. Let's go back to our qualifier. So now I've got these things selected. Now whatever I do with my controls, let's go into my primaries, are only going to affect those things that are selected here. So like I said, if I want it to be more of a fall, maybe I'm going to take out some of the green and blue and kind of shift things a little more orange yellow. Yeah, something like that. And it'll look like this. Now you can start to see here, because I've shifted it really far, you can see where these things are dropping off. Let's actually turn off that gradient. I don't think I like that here. And then I can go back in here and say, I really need to be grabbing more stuff. Let's widen that out a little bit. Now maybe we're getting somewhere. I would say this is pretty extreme. This is a pretty massive change, but you can see that works reasonably well even in this case. And maybe let's put this gradient back on, but just really shift it down. If you noticed, it was affecting those cars, and I'm getting these weird kind of glows on those. So let's leave the cars alone, all this stuff down here, and just grab those up here and those leaves. And we could also, again, do something that was more subtle with this. Something else I might do is say, don't affect the things that are totally unsaturated. And let's actually affect some of these mid-tone ones. A little more red, a little less straight up yellow. So I do something like that. And then one other thing I can do, again, you get a lot of your power and resolve from being able to combine some of these things together, like combining a qualifier with a power window, or a power window with a gradient or whatever, is, let's say I generally like this effect, but it's a little strong for me. I don't want it to come on all the way through. So I can go into here where it says key and click on that and go to where it says key output. And this is basically how much of the effect of this node it's going to put in. So 1 is 100%, it's going to use it fully. If I change this to a 0, it doesn't do that effect at all. But I can put this anywhere in between, so I can get, some of that effect. If I want like these leaves starting to turn, but they're not quite fully turned yet, I could do something like that. Again, to toggle this, I'm going from that look to this, just kind of warming those up some, but it's not as extreme as sort of this full-on gold. And I can actually even go higher than that. If I want to sort of double strength the effect, I could do something like that. But this is a really handy effect if you like something that you're doing, but you just don't want to kind of bring it quite as fully in as you originally had it. So that's my key there. And the last just sort of basic element I'd like to show you. Let's go over to a new node. So you can see I've just strung together a bunch of nodes here, and they will be applied in this order. And I always want to end, if I'm going to use it, with this final vignette around the edges. is adjusting some of these curves. And so I'll go to the curves tab here. And this is something I think is often underutilized by students when they're first getting into coloring. And there's several different curves I can use. So the default one when this comes up is sort of your standard curve from black over here to white over here. The bottom is your input. The vertical is your output. So if you think just like ninth grade geometry, this is what's coming in, this is what's going out. So right now it's saying 0 input. So like black is 0 output, 100% input, total white is 100% output. And so you could see if, for instance, I said, hey, I want to move this up here, and no matter what's coming in, I want it to be white. You'll see I still have this node selected, so it's just doing that to the parts that were being affected by this node. Let's undo that. If I do the same thing over on this node, you'll see I can make the whole image go white, because I'm saying no matter what the input is, everything should be white. Or no matter what the input is, everything should be black. And so if I want to tweak the general curve here, I could. So if I want things to, maybe go out to bright a little earlier and stay dark a little longer, I can go with something that's like more contrasty like this. So that's one of your basic curves, but you have a whole bunch of different options here to look at. And these are the ones I think can give you a lot of power if you think about what they're doing. And I think just often are underused. So all of these over here kind of show what you're looking at. You can see the drop down for all the options. So for instance, just as an example, here's hue versus saturation. So what this is saying is, depending on what hue is in here, I want to make those more or less saturated. So let's say I wanted his skin tones to be more saturated. So I could look and say, okay, the skin tones seem to be about in this range here. So I just clicked on it with my eyedropper to get some ideas. And then I could say, okay, I want those more saturated. So I'm going to start pulling up those. And you can see, grab some of those pinker areas there because I had this pink selected. If I spread this out, I can really pull out some of those pinks there. Now that's a tricky one to get a whole lot of effect on, because if you look at this, there's kind of a lot of different tones and saturations and brightness throughout his skin. If, let's say, we just want to do like this little red bit on the hat that's pretty uniform. Now this is something I could do with a qualifier as well. So I could go here and, select this with the eyedropper and do it. But I just wanted to show you that these graphs are also a way to affect some of these things. Let's do that. And that says that's like right smack dab there. So let's just really saturate that. And you can see, that is just basically glowing now. I could do the reverse and say, let's make it unsaturated and kind of go that full black and white for that and just bring it kind of out of there. And you can see it's a little around the edges it didn't capture. So maybe I need to broaden this out a little bit to get some of those edges. Broaden it out on this side as well. And get something like that. There could be specific situations you want to use these. You could say, hey, if things are really bright, I want them more saturated or less saturated. So let's say, I want things that are brighter to be really saturated and things that are dark to be really unsaturated. If you look at what this just did with the trees here, you can see these darker parts kind of went full on grayscale, and these brighter parts are really kind of popping compared to what it was originally. So this was without that, and then this is with it. I still have this effect on here. And of course, it's not just affecting the trees, it's affecting him and his hat and everything else as well. So this is not a good correction. In fact, let's reset that back to 0. But that's another tool you have available to play with. So there are a lot of things that you can do within here, but remembering the sort of general workflow, first thing is put on your LUT and just bring kind of back to relatively normal looking, essentially do your correction first. And then you start doing your grading. And we talked about setting your black and white levels, talked about doing some changes using a qualifier, talked about using some power windows. I just talked here, although I turned it off, about using some of the level adjustments. And in this case, did it just to get rid of this little red thing that was maybe drawing our attention. and maybe we don't want to sort of really highlight that part of his hat. That's not where our focus is. And then lastly, kind of putting this vignette on the whole thing. So those are all some techniques you could use with the FS7 footage and kind of a good way to approach it. And the last thing I want to do before I get to this vignette is I always like at the very end, when I've done all of my other grading, to bring the scopes back up and just again make sure I've got some sort of true blacks and true whites and make sure things are in the general shape that I want and that I haven't blown out levels or created something where maybe my blacks used to be black and now they're split apart again. In this case, it looks pretty good. In fact, looks like on the very high end, I'm maybe clipping off a little more than I want there. Let's bring that down so I don't have so much flat lining against here. And I think on the low end, it's pretty okay. Looks like maybe I want to bring just a little bit more red into my lows. Something like that. And so that's pretty subtle, but so this is, yeah, that's where it was. And this is what I've done. And you notice the main thing that's happening is up here in this very bright area. Instead of it sort of blowing out so much, I'm just bringing a little bit of that edging back in. And then down here in the darks, changing that as well a little bit. It also seemed like it kind of dimmed down my mids, maybe a little more than I wanted. I like that kind of bright look, so let's just pull our gamma up just a little bit to brighten that back up and maybe bring in a little more saturation, and I end up kind of back where I want it to be. And I'll also say this Command D I'm doing, this is a really useful thing I think to get familiar with doing to see how a particular change you're doing is affecting things. If I want to see what I just did, here's where I was, here's what I added to it, which of those do I like better? It's very similar to lighting. In fact, you can think of color grading as kind of like your last step of lighting. Obviously, it works a lot better the better your lighting was on set, the more it gives you to work with. But it's my last chance to sort of control and affect some of that. So I'll toggle a lot of these to see there was without, there was with, which do I like better? In the same way you might turn a light off and on quickly on set to see what that light is doing. Okay, so that was it. Hope that is helpful, and definitely watch the other videos about color grading to get a fuller picture, but this was a good intro. Good luck.